Hello, welcome to Pamphlet Global. I'm Raja Munir, and today we're going to talk about Pakistan again. And what about Pakistan? Now, Pakistan has been stuck in a strategic quagmire. Donald Trump's recent call with the Muslim countries, with the leaders of Muslim countries, is something which has really got Pakistan stuck into a position it will find itself increasingly difficult to either climb out of or climb into it. This all started when Donald Trump basically declared that if the peace agreement with Iran is reached, then the Arab and Muslim countries would eventually have to normalize relationships with Israel under the Abraham Accords framework. It is not just a diplomatic statement he was trying to make, but he has basically dropped the mother of all geopolitical bombs over the Muslim world over a phone call with Saudi King Mohammed bin Saud, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan of UAE, Emir of Qatar Mohammed Al Thani, Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir, Erdogan from Turkey, Abdul Fattah Sisi of Egypt, King Abdullah II of Jordan, and King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa of Bahrain were all present on a call when he asked them to sign Abraham Accords as part of a peace deal that his administration succeeds in signing with Iran on the Strait of Hormuz and the West Asia conflict that is going on. Now, Trump himself put it out that there was stunned silence on the phone from the other end. He basically joked that if anybody is there or everybody has dropped the phone line, but everybody was on the phone line, though there has been, no formal recognition or denial of whether these countries or any of these countries, apart from a few which in 2020 already did that, which is UAE, Morocco, Sudan, and Bahrain. Apart from them, no other country actually, just sat on the sidelines and listened to Trump very keenly, because Trump has made it now mandatory for people, for Middle East and the Islamic world, to accept Israel under Abraham Accords as a part of deal for Iran. And that, for if what we can say in cricket terms, is the biggest geopolitical googly he has delivered to everyone who was who's been on his side on this war with Iran. Now, this statement is something which signals something much bigger, because in an attempt to completely restructure the political position of the Muslim world on Israel and Palestine, and for Pakistan, this may become one of the most dangerous strategic crises in its modern history. It really has the potential to be like that, because unlike the Gulf monarchies, Pakistan is in no position to normalize relations with Israel without risking an ideological explosion inside its own society. Now, Abraham Accords were never really simply about peace in the Middle East. They were about actually redesigning the political architecture of the Middle East and the Muslim world in itself, because for decades the Palestinian issue has functioned as the emotional glue of an Islamic world. Even pro-American Arab regimes maintained symbolic hostility towards Israel because supporting Palestine gave them the religious and political legitimacy at home. But by 2020, that old consensus had started basically collapsing, because the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan normalized ties with Israel under the American mediation on Abraham Accords. And the logic behind it was brutally strategic, because the Gulf monarchies no longer saw Israel as a main threat. They saw Iran, they saw the political Islam, internal instability, and economic stagnation as bigger dangers. That prompted them to, think about, for access to American security guarantees, Israeli technology, intelligence cooperation, and economic modernization became far more important than maintaining symbolic anti-Israel rhetoric. And that changed the entire geopolitical, vocabulary of the Muslim world. For decades, the formula was simple: no recognition of Israel until Palestine is resolved. And, that has been a cry across all Muslim countries traditionally for a very long time now. What Donald Trump did was, in his first tenure as well, was that he reversed that formula completely. He said that normalize the relationship first, sideline Palestine for later. And that is exactly what happened with the Gulf countries, with few of them as well. That single shift weakened the Palestinians' biggest geopolitical weapon, which was a collective Islamic solidarity. Now, under the Abraham Accords framework, Israel stopped being treated as an isolated ideological enemy. Instead, Israel became integrated into the new American-led regional security bloc, and UAE placed increasingly a big role into that. A bloc that was primarily aimed against Iran and against Islamist movements that threatened Gulf monarchies internally. In practical terms, Israel transformed from outsider to a central pillar of the new Middle Eastern order in itself, and now Trump wants to expand that order deeper into the Islamic world. That is where Pakistan enters this picture, because Pakistan occupies a unique, dangerous position. Unlike Gulf monarchies, Pakistan's entire state identity was built for decades around Islamic nationalization and radicalization, anti-Israel rhetoric, and ideological mobilization around Palestine. And that creates a massive contradiction within Pakistan in itself. Because Pakistan is not simply another Muslim country debating, a foreign policy or having a free foreign policy. Pakistan has spent decades constructing an ideological ecosystem where hostility towards Israel became deeply embedded into the state identity itself. The Pakistani passport itself, is a testimony to the fact where it says that, travel to is okay for all, every country. A passport is valid for every country except Israel. So that is where this whole anti-Israel rhetoric, how deep this anti-Israel rhetoric in Pakistan goes. And not only on their passports, but let's talk about their school textbooks, their mosque rhetoric, their television discourse, their Islamist organizations, whether political or non-political or charitable radical organizations that operate openly in Pakistan, and the sections even of the security establishment. They have all reinforced the same narrative that Israel is a permanent civilizational enemy of Muslims. But this ideological infrastructure was never really about Israel alone. It was also tied to Pakistan's broader security doctrine. The same ecosystem that promoted anti-Israel narratives also fed anti-India jihadist narratives and justified support for Islamist terror organizations across the regions and ones operating inside Pakistan. They were the ideological fuel for these organizations. So over time, the Pakistani state radicalized large sections of its own society for strategic purposes. Now that very ecosystem has become Pakistan's biggest internal threat. So now Pakistan's biggest threat is that if Pakistan moves towards normalization with Israel, even unofficially, the consequences could be explosive within Pakistan, because Islamist groups inside Pakistan will not interpret normalization as a mere diplomatic formality. They will interpret it as a complete betrayal by an Islamic state. And for jihadist organizations, opposition to Israel is not merely a geopolitical, tool. It is a theological concept and a theological weapon they have with them. And once a state spends decades promoting absolutist ideological narratives, reversing course becomes extremely dangerous. This is what makes Pakistan different from the Gulf monarchies, because in Gulf, the entire system works very differently than it works in Pakistan, because the Gulf states possess tightly controlled political systems. They have enormous financial resources, and their ability to suppress ideological unrest is also pretty high. Pakistan does not possess any of these, and Pakistan today is politically unstable, economically weak, and deeply radicalized country. In such an environment, normalization with Israel would not only be viewed as a routine foreign policy decision, it would be viewed as an ideological surrender to a Jewish state. And the consequences could be severe, because, you will have masked unrest in Pakistan, you could have radical mobilization, you could have sectarian violence, you could have increased militancy, and even internal fragmentation pressures within the state structure itself. Not only that, but also in this case, the Taliban in Afghanistan basically becomes an ideological successor of the state of Pakistan. That is how dangerous it can be for Pakistan. Well, what's the second option for Pakistan? But that second option could be equally dangerous for Pakistan, and that would be of refusal, which everybody is saying that Pakistan may not join. But let's look at, if they refuse, what's going to happen, because refusing American pressure also causes enormous costs. And a man like Trump, it's going to be very difficult to say no to him for Pakistan, because Pakistan's economy remains heavily dependent on IMF bailouts, Gulf financing, dollar inflows, and international debt restructuring mechanisms heavily influenced by Washington. The United States does not even need to direct sanctions to destabilize Pakistan. All they need is to create enough financial pressures alone to create a massive economic pain to Pakistan. And militarily too, Pakistan remains very vulnerable because its conventional capabilities still depend heavily on imported systems, external financing, and diplomatic balancing between China, the Gulf, and the West. If relations with Washington deteriorate sharply, if push comes to shove, then Pakistan risks deeper international isolation, precisely when its internal security environment is already rapidly deteriorating, which means that Pakistan is trapped between two crises here. If it bends towards Washington, it risks ideological instability internally. And if it resists Washington, it risks economic and geopolitical punishment externally. Now, this moment is very different because for decades, Pakistan has survived through strategic ambiguity. Internationally, it has cooperated with the West, and when necessary, whether it was during the Afghan war or during war on terror, we have seen it time and again happening, even right now with Iran war going on. Domestically, it sustained Islamist narratives to preserve its legitimacy. But the Abraham Accords era is changing that balance completely. The new American frameworks demands open alignment. And that is the key here, because the Gulf monarchies have already made their choice. A few of them have, and the others who are sitting on the sideline were not very averse to the idea as well, including Saudi Arabia. They have prioritized regime survival, economic modernization, and strategic integration with the United States over ideological confrontation with Israel. Pakistan cannot make that transition easily because its ideological foundations are fundamentally different. And that is the real crisis now that haunts Islamabad. The very ideological forces Pakistan once cultivated for geopolitical purposes have become too powerful to reverse safely for the state of Pakistan. Now, if I sum it up, it's going to be, the Trump's renewed push for expanding the Abraham Accords is therefore just not a diplomatic initiative. It is a geopolitical stress test for the Islamic world, and for Pakistan, it may even become a civilizational crisis, because this collision is no longer going to happen at the borders. And by borders, I mean Pakistan's borders. It is going to happen right inside the ideological foundations of the state of Pakistan itself. Because for decades, Pakistan has used anti-Israel sentiment as part of its identity structure. But now the geopolitical order around it is changing rapidly. As the Gulf is moving in one direction, America is pushing harder, and Israel is becoming somewhat integrated into the new regional security order that Donald Trump administration is trying to create. And Pakistan is being forced into a choice it spent decades trying to avoid, a choice between ideological posturing and strategic survival. And that may prove far more dangerous for Pakistan than any external military threat it has ever faced. Thank you.